The Bible is a library of books written by many different authors over hundreds of years, and those human authors came from many different backgrounds and they bring many different stories. But there is one story that runs across the entire Bible, one overarching story that goes from Genesis to Revelation, and the author of that one story is God himself. This story started a long time ago. It began with a newly created order, a new world, bursting with life, bursting with colour and energy, beautiful, stunning, awesome. It's the world of Genesis 1. Yet within a few short pages, something awful has happened. There's even been a murder, and sin enters the world. Everything suddenly changes in the story, and like a blot of ink on a white sheet of paper, everything is suddenly spoilt. Increasingly, the themes of Genesis become frustration, sorrow, and pain. But the author of the story steps in, and he figures out a rescue mission to put things right. So around 2000 BC, he chooses a man called Abraham, and he makes a promise to Abraham. He says, Abraham, from you will come thousands of people, a new nation, and from that one nation, Israel, people will learn to follow me. There'll be a light to the world, he says. While this story of Genesis continues, it moves on with many plots and subplots, twists and turns. Abraham is followed by Isaac and then Jacob, until around 1500 BC, there is a nation of Israel, thousands of them, but they are slaves in Egypt. And they're crying out in their pain. But the author of the story hears them crying out, and he rescues them once again, and he does it through a man called Moses. We call it the Exodus. So Moses, after many different plagues and discussions with Pharaoh, finally gets his people out of Egypt. The people escape, but they end up wandering in the deserts of the Middle East for decades, until finally, now under a man called Joshua, who is the successor to Moses, they do enter a new land, as was promised to Abraham. A kingdom is established in this new land. It's ancient Israel with the author at its centre. It's ruled by people called judges, like Samson and Gideon and Deborah. Although there are a few bad apples, by and large, Israel does pretty well at this time. In fact, things go so well that the nation of Israel, settled and confident, start looking around, and they see all the other nations around them, and these other nations don't have judges, they have kings. So Israel gets the idea, well, we want a king as well. We want to be a proper nation. The author knows this is a bad idea, but the people carry on crying out for a king. And so in the book of Samuel, Israel gets its first king. He's called Saul. King Saul, is followed by King David. He's the most famous of the ancient kings of Israel. Until at around 1000 BC, David is ruling and Israel is at an all-time peak in its history. They're thriving and prosperous, they defeat their enemies, they build community, they work the land, and they more or less worship God, the author. But David is only a man. He makes mistakes, he commits adultery, he commits murder. After David, Solomon takes over, but after Solomon's death, there's a new direction for Israel. Suddenly, everything changes for the worse. They were prosperous and doing so well, but now suddenly Israel they have bitter civil wars and disputes. They fall out with each other until eventually the nation of Israel splits into two, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Each of the kingdoms have their own kings now. We read about them in the books called Kings. These kings, pretty much almost all of them fail. And Israel as a nation fails. In fact, they end up worshipping foreign gods, idols made from wood and stone. There are warnings again and again from people that God sends called prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. These prophets say, come back to the author, stop worshipping these idols, or the author will give you over, he will give you up. But they don't listen. Until eventually in the 6th century BC, Israel is led away into captivity. Once again as slaves. For the second time in their history, they are slaves. Not this time in Egypt, but in a country called Babylon, or what we now call Iraq. One or two, like Daniel, do pretty well. But for most of them, this is a time of mourning, a time of bitter regret, remembering the good times that they had, the promise to Abraham that came true, and now they've lost it all. But in the darkness, those the prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, they suggest there is still hope. They're in this country of Babylon as slaves for 70 years, and they weep and they wail and they cry out until once again the author intervenes in the story. And so around 550 BC, under an emperor called Cyrus, he sets them free. He says, you can go back to your country of Israel. Go back. And in the books called Nehemiah and Ezra, they tell us how Israel returns from Babylon to ancient Israel. They rebuild the walls, they rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and they set themselves up again as a nation. They are no longer proud and mighty. They are broken and worshipping a foreign king, serving a foreign king, but they are a nation once again. That's the Old Testament. We fast forward now through 400 years, the rise and fall of the Greeks and the rise now of the Roman Empire, until eventually this story continues, but it continues into what we call the New Testament, but it reaches a tipping point in the story. The time now is around 0 AD when Caesar Augustus is emperor in Rome, and something astonishing happens. Once again, the author changes the direction of the story in a completely unpredictable manner, because the author himself enters the story. He visits the earth, but not as people expect, not as a great king, not as a warrior come to throw the Romans out. The author comes in disguise. He comes accepting taunts and ridicule. He comes to a poor family as a descendant of Abraham, but in a poor family. He comes, in fact, as a baby. For now, they call him Yeshua or Jesus. And the writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell us of this Jesus. And this Jesus tells us of a different way of living, which on the face of it makes no sense. He says things like, love your enemies, pray for people who persecute you. He says, don't worry, seek first God's kingdom. And he says, I've not come to restrict your life, but to give you a full and free life in all its fullness, a meaningful life. And he makes people better, not just physically better, he does that, but spiritually better. He makes them whole. He gives them purpose and vision, and he tells them of a kingdom to come, a new kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. And he becomes very popular. In fact, thousands flock to hear him, so much so that he becomes a great worry to the authorities. And ultimately, this part of the story has a horrible ending, because Jesus is taken to a cross, the Roman instrument of torture and execution. He hasn't done anything wrong, but the world has done many things wrong, and Jesus takes the blame. He dies, and it's a shocking and awful death. But it's not the end. Yet again, the author does the unexpected, and without warning, he reconfigures the laws of nature, which he himself created back in Genesis 1. And without warning, Jesus rises from death and announces victory over everything that's gone wrong in the world, and announcing victory even over death itself. The excitement of this man come back from the grave generates a huge following. A new movement is born. We read about it in the book called Acts. And this new movement spreads like wildfire across a world desperate for hope. People call it the church. One man in particular, Paul, also a descendant of Abraham, has a huge role to play. He starts new churches and he writes letters to them to encourage them. And other disciples, other apostles also write letters to these new churches. But Paul himself and the church make a huge discovery. They discover it's no longer about being a descendant of Abraham. You don't have to be a descendant of Abraham to belong to this church. Anyone who puts their faith in Jesus can enter the story for themselves. The story doesn't stop there. It carries on, always going forwards. In fact, here we are today talking about this story, and it continues. It won't stop. It moves at an even more accelerated pace. Now the story looks forward to a new time, a time still to come, a restoration of that original perfect world which you remember in Genesis. And this whole story completes in the last book of the Bible, which we call Revelation. It's not just a completion, but a conclusion that goes on forever. Everything is restored as it was in the beginning, a new world of radiant beauty, restored relationships, fulfilled longings. My dwelling place will be with my people, says the author. And the author's dwelling place, heaven, is this world as the author always intended it to be. And then on the very last page of this story, of this book, the author makes a new promise. He says, I will wipe away every tear from your eyes. There will be no more death, no more crying, no more sorrow, no more pain. The old things have passed away. What a story. Welcome to the Bible.